This is the story of how the most powerful air force in Europe was completely erased from existence, then resurrected 11 years later as two separate air forces serving opposite sides of the Cold War. Germany's Luftwaffe had terrorized Allied bomber crews and dominated the skies over Poland, France, and the Soviet Union, but the victorious Allies systematically dismantled it, scattering its personnel to prison camps and civilian life, while seizing its revolutionary technology. By 1956, German pilots were flying jets again, some commanding NATO squadrons and others serving the Soviet Union, and what happened in between involves war crimes trials, technological espionage, and one of history's strangest military resurrections. Approximately 2.2 million Luftwaffe personnel faced an uncertain future between May 1945 and January 1956. War crimes trials claimed some, Soviet prison camps held others for a decade, and many simply returned to civilian life, with their military careers seemingly finished forever. The Allies conducted the largest technology seizure in history during this period, capturing over 16,000 items of German aviation equipment and using it to reshape the jet age. The aircraft and research left behind would influence everything from the Korean War to the space race. Let's start at the end, with the final week of the Luftwaffe's existence, the last commander and the final surrender. Bertin Caves massacre formed the core of the trial after Italian partisans killed 33 German soldiers in Rome on March 23, 1944. Kesselring approved Hitler's order for 10-to-1 reprisals, and 335 Italian civilians were executed in the caves outside Rome the next day. The court found him guilty and sentenced him to death by firing squad on May 6, 1947, but the sentence was commuted to life imprisonment on July 4th, and he was released in October 1952 on grounds of ill health. Not every Luftwaffe commander faced conviction. General Feldmarschall Hugo Sperle, the first commander of the Condor Legion during the Spanish Civil War, walked free when he was acquitted of all charges in the High Command trial, despite facing accusations related to the bombing of Guernica. The Dachau trials prosecuted approximately 200 cases involving atrocities against downed Allied airmen between August 1945 and December 1947. These trials resulted in 82 executions by hanging, and the cases typically involved German personnel who had shot or beaten captured Allied pilots and crew members rather than treating them as prisoners of war. The trials proceeded while the Allies conducted a different kind of operation, one focused not on punishment, but on seizing the Luftwaffe's technological secrets. Allied intelligence officers had compiled extensive lists of German aircraft and technology they wanted to capture even before the war ended. Operation Lusty, Luftwaffe's secret technology, officially began on April 20, 1945, and it became one of the largest technology seizures in military history. Two teams with different objectives divided the operation. Colonel Harold E. Watson led Watson's Whizzers, tasked with collecting actual aircraft, while Colonel Howard M. McCoy's team focused on recruiting scientists, collecting documents, and investigating research facilities. Between them, these teams acquired 16,280 items weighing 6,200 tons, and 2,388 of those items were selected for detailed technical analysis. Watson's team achieved their most spectacular success at Lechfeld Airfield near Augsburg, where they found 9 Me-262 jets, the world's first operational jet fighter, with approximately 25 intact examples on site. Getting these revolutionary aircraft back to Allied territory posed a problem, and the solution was both practical and ironic. Watson's team enlisted captured German test pilots to fly the aircraft for them. Hauptmann Heinz Brauer and Karl Bauer, Messerschmitt's chief test pilot, were among these pilots. Days earlier, they'd been fighting Allied bombers, and now they found themselves flying captured German aircraft to collection points under American supervision. The British escort carrier HMS Reaper prepared for an unusual cargo in July 1945. More than 30 advanced German aircraft were loaded aboard at Cherbourg, France, and the ship departed on July 20, 1945, arriving at Newark, New Jersey on July 28, carrying the cream of German aviation technology to America. Some of the most advanced designs of World War II were among the captured aircraft. The Messerschmitt Me 262 represented a quantum leap in fighter technology, and of the 1,433 to 1,443 Me 262s built during the war, only 9 original aircraft survive today. One of the most significant examples is WW2 50491, now displayed at the National Air and Space Museum, and this particular aircraft shows 49 victory marks from Jagdgeschwader 7, proving the jet's combat effectiveness in its brief operational life. British forces captured approximately 50 Heinkel He-162 Volksjägers, the People's Fighter, at Lech Airfield on May 8, 1945. Designed to be mass-produced using semi-skilled labor and non-strategic materials, only 5 of these small jets survive in museums today, including examples at the National Air and Space Museum and the Canada Aviation and Space Museum. The Arado R-234 Blitz holds the distinction of being the world's first operational jet bomber. WW2 140-312, displayed at the Udvar Hazy Center, is the sole survivor captured at Sola Airfield in Norway and representing the only remnant of Germany's jet bomber program. The Dornier Du 335 Pfeil was perhaps the most remarkable aircraft captured. The world's fastest piston engine fighter, with its unique push-pull engine configuration, putting one engine in the nose and one in the tail, outpacing almost anything in the sky. The sole surviving Du 335 WW2 famously outpaced its P-51 Mustang Escort by 45 minutes during the transit to Cherbourg for shipment to America. General Patton's Third Army discovered the Horten Ho 299 at Friedrichsroda, a revolutionary flying wing design that had anticipated stealth technology by decades. The V-3 prototype is the sole surviving airframe and is currently under conservation at the National Air and Space Museum. Complete aircraft weren't the only prize the Allies wanted. Understanding the technology that made these machines possible was the real treasure. The Junkers Jumo 004 turbojet engine represented one of the most significant technological achievements of the war, as the world's first mass-produced turbojet engine and its axial flow compressor design became the foundation for virtually all modern jet engines. The Soviets immediately recognized its value and copied the Jumo 004, producing it as the RD-10 to power their Yak-15 fighter. The influence went far deeper than simple copying, though. The Jumo 04's design principles of axial compressors, afterburning capability, and variable exhaust nozzles became standard features in jet engine development worldwide. The swept-wing breakthrough proved equally revolutionary. Boeing engineer George Scherer was examining captured German research papers in the final weeks of the war when he discovered something that would change aviation history. The German research showed that thin, swept wings could delay the onset of compressibility problems that plagued straight-wing designs at high speeds. This discovery directly enabled the redesign of the North American F-86 Sabre, which was originally designed with straight wings until North Americans swept them back to 35 degrees after reviewing the German research. The F-86 also borrowed the Me-262's automatic leading-edge slats and electrically adjustable stabilizer, and these weren't just incremental improvements. They were the difference between a mediocre fighter and the aircraft that would dominate the skies over Korea. Boeing's B-47 Stratojet bomber similarly benefited from German swept-wing research, influencing the design of America's first swept-wing strategic bomber. Operation Lusty was just the beginning, though. The Allies wanted not just the aircraft and documents, but the minds that had created them. Over 1,600 German scientists were ultimately recruited for American programs through Operation Paperclip, which ran from July 1945 through 1959. Many came from aviation and rocket programs that had been closely associated with the Luftwaffe. Werner von Braun was the most famous, serving as technical director of the V-2 rocket program before becoming the architect of NASA's Saturn V rocket that took Americans to the moon. The aviation experts proved equally significant, though. Hans von Ohain, designer of the first operational turbojet engine, later became director of the U.S. Air Force's Aero Propulsion Laboratory, and Alexander Lippisch, the Delta Wing pioneer, saw his research lead directly to the development of the Convair F-102 and F-106 interceptors. Adolf Bussmann had discovered the benefits of swept wings and later proposed using ceramic tiles for the space shuttle's heat shield, while Ferdinand Brandner, who had worked on advanced propulsion systems, went to work for the Americans and contributed to the development of several engine programs. The Soviets conducted their own recruitment with less subtle methods. Operation Aviation on October 22, 1946, saw Soviet forces forcibly deport over 2,500 specialists and 4,000 family members to the USSR, and approximately 1,385 of these specialists worked in aviation. Ferdinand Brandner, despite having worked with the Americans, eventually found his way to the Soviet Union, where he helped develop the NK-12 turboprop engine that powered the Tu-95 Bear bomber, an aircraft that still flies today. Brunolf Bade led development of the EF-131, an experimental forward-swept wing bomber. The technology transfer was complete at this point. German jet engines powered early American and Soviet fighters. German swept-wing research enabled the F-86 and the MiG-15 that fought each other over Korea, and German rocket scientists built both the Apollo program and the Soviet missiles that carried Yuri Gagarin into orbit. The Allies were seizing technology and recruiting scientists while simultaneously destroying what remained of German aviation capability. A series of Allied Control Council directives formally dissolved the Luftwaffe and left no room for ambiguity. Allied Control Council Law No. 34, issued on August 20, 1946, formally dissolved the Wehrmacht, including all three branches, meaning the Luftwaffe, the Kriegsmarine, and the Heer, ceased to exist as legal entities. Earlier directives had already been dismantling German military capabilities piece by piece. ACC Law No. 8, issued on November 30, 1945, eliminated all military and paramilitary training, while ACC Directive No. 22, issued on December 6, 1945, ordered the clearing of airfields and destruction of military installations. The scale of destruction was comprehensive. Records show that 177,000 tons of Luftwaffe materiel was scrapped, including 50,000 tons of anti-aircraft guns, and every aircraft production facility was dismantled. Equipment was either shipped as reparations to the Allied powers or simply destroyed. Training facilities closed, flight schools disbanded, and even glider clubs were dissolved. The Allies systematically dismantled key research facilities that survived the war intact. Luftfahrtforschungsanstalt Völkenrode, Germany's most advanced aviation research establishment, fell into Allied hands, complete with its supersonic wind tunnels, and the equipment was studied, catalogued, and either shipped abroad or destroyed. Erprobungsstelle Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's central testing ground, met a different fate. On April 10, 1945, 170 American bombers virtually destroyed the facility, before Soviet forces captured what remained on May 2nd. The documentation survived better than the infrastructure and equipment, ironically enough. The U.S. National Archives holds over 70,000 microfilm rolls of captured German records, including 1.2 million Luftwaffe aerial photographs, and most of the original documents were eventually returned to Germany in the 1970s after being microfilmed. They now reside at the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg im Breisgau. The aviation prohibition was absolute. Germans were forbidden from building or flying powered aircraft. The ban lasted until 1951 for civilian aircraft and gliding, and military aviation remained forbidden until NATO membership in 1955. For nearly a decade, the nation that had pioneered jet fighters and swept-wing designs was prohibited from flying anything more sophisticated than a glider. The question remained, though, what happened to the men who had flown for the Luftwaffe, particularly the aces whose names had struck fear into Allied bomber crews? Germany's top fighter pilots faced wildly different post-war fates, ranging from Soviet prison camps to the highest levels of NATO command. Erich Hartmann, with 352 confirmed victories, was the highest-scoring fighter ace in history. American forces accepted his surrender on May 8, 1945, and he expected to be treated as a prisoner of war. But 6 days later, he was transferred to Soviet custody under the Yalta Agreements. That transfer marked the beginning of a nightmare that would last a decade. The Soviets convicted Hartmann of deliberate shooting of 780 Soviet civilians and destroying 345 expensive Soviet aircraft, charges that were political rather than factual, since he'd been a fighter pilot engaging military targets. The sentence reflected the political nature: 25 years of hard labor. Soviet prison camps held Hartmann for the next 10 years. He refused multiple offers to spy on fellow officers and refused to join the East German Air Force, which earned him solitary confinement and forced him into hunger strikes. His son, Erich Peter, was born in 1945 and died in 1948 at age 3, and Hartmann never saw him. October 1955 brought his release as part of the final prisoner exchange, following Chancellor Adenauer's negotiations with Soviet Premier Khrushchev. West Germany welcomed him back after 10 years of imprisonment, and in 1956 he joined the newly formed Bundesluftwaffe. By 1970, he was commanding Jagdgeschwader 71 Richthofen, though he retired that year after publicly criticizing the F-104 starfighter program. Russia posthumously exonerated him of all charges in January 1997, more than 20 years after his death. Gerhard Barkhorn, the second highest scoring ace with 301 victories, had a very different experience. Western Allied forces accepted his surrender and released him the same year, and when the Bundesluftwaffe formed in 1956, he rejoined and eventually rose to the rank of General Major, serving as Chief of Staff of NATO's 2nd Allied Tactical Air Force. A car accident on January 8, 1983, killed his wife Crystal instantly, and Gerhard died from his injuries 3 days later. Günther Rall, with 275 victories, became one of the most successful post-war Luftwaffe officers. The Bundesluftwaffe recruited him in 1954, and he rose through the ranks to become Inspekteur der Luftwaffe from 1971 to 1974, the Air Force's senior officer, equivalent to Chief of Staff. His career ended in October 1975 following a controversial private visit to apartheid South Africa. Johannes Steinhoff, credited with 176 victories, barely survived the war. He crashed during takeoff in an Me-262 on April 18, 1945, and was pulled from the burning wreckage, with severe burns covering much of his body. The next 2 years were spent undergoing reconstructive surgery, But despite his injuries, he became the third Inspekteur der Luftwaffe and later rose to become chairman of the NATO Military Committee from 1971 to 1974, the alliance's highest military position. A man who had fought against the Western Allies ended up commanding NATO's entire military structure. Adolf Galland, with 104 victories, and former General der Jagdflieger, the Luftwaffe's fighter commander, was initially considered for leadership positions in the Bundesluftwaffe. USAF Chief of Staff General Nathan Twining reportedly blocked him, likely due to Galland's work with Argentina's Air Force from 1948 to 1955, and he never served in the new German Air Force, instead running an aviation consultancy and serving as an advisor for the 1969 film Battle of Britain. Hans-Ulrich Rudel presents the darkest post-war story. The most decorated German serviceman of World War II, credited with destroying 519 tanks as a Stuka pilot, Rudel became an unrepentant Nazi after the war. In 1948, he emigrated to Argentina using a Red Cross passport under a false name and founded an organization that aided Nazi war criminals fleeing Europe. He reportedly sheltered Josef Mengele, the Auschwitz doctor, and remained active in neo-Nazi politics until his death in 1982. Luftwaffe F-4 Phantoms reportedly overflew his funeral, a controversial tribute that sparked outrage. These men represented the extremes of post-war experience, Hartmann enduring Soviet imprisonment before serving NATO, Steinhoff rising to command the Atlantic Alliance, and Rudel embracing the ideology that had led Germany to ruin. Most Luftwaffe personnel simply returned to civilian life, with their military service seemingly over forever, except it wasn't, because by the mid-1950s, the geopolitical situation had changed dramatically. Secret planning began the path to recreating a German Air Force. The West German government created the Amt Blank, the Blank Office, in October 1950, ostensibly to study questions with regard to the strengthening of Allied troops, though in reality it was planning German rearmament. The Himmerod Conference that same month brought together former Wehrmacht officers to draft plans for a new German military. 12 divisions and 500,000 servicemen were proposed, but they attached a critical condition: rehabilitation of the Wehrmacht's reputation. A recognition that not all Wehrmacht soldiers had been war criminals was demanded, along with assurance that serving in the new force would not be considered a continuation of Nazi militarism. The Paris Agreement, signed on October 23, 1954, provided the legal framework. These agreements terminated the Allied occupation, recognized West German sovereignty, and permitted rearmament within the NATO framework. West Germany joined NATO on May 6, 1955, and on January 9, 1956, the Bundesluftwaffe was officially founded. The choice of first commander carried significance. General Lieutenant Josef Kammhuber took the position of Inspekteur der Luftwaffe on June 1, 1957, and during World War II, Kammhuber had created the famous Kammhuber Line, the integrated air defense system of searchlights, flak, and night fighters that had savaged RAF Bomber Command. Building a new air force largely modeled on the United States Air Force became his task, and he was promoted to full general on May 9, 1961, the only single service inspector to achieve 4-star rank while still in office. Personnel questions proved controversial from the start. Recruitment drew heavily on former Luftwaffe personnel, though all candidates underwent vetting by a personnel screening board that examined Nazi Party membership, wartime activities, and any potential involvement in war crimes. 61 former Wehrmacht generals had passed screening by autumn 1957, and of these, 42 actually joined the new force. About 27% of the Bundeswehr's initial officer corps consisted of former Wehrmacht personnel, and the screening process even approved some former Waffen-SS members. Of 117 applications, 58 were approved by September 1956. America provided the aircraft. The first acquisition was 450 Republic F-84F Thunderstreaks, received beginning in 1956, though these aircraft proved problematic with a 36% crash rate. They were followed by 300 Canadair Sabre Mk5 and Mk6 jets, the same basic design that had dominated the skies over Korea. Erich Hartmann, the world's highest-scoring ace, just released from Soviet imprisonment, commanded Jagdgeschwader 71 Richthofen, which achieved operational capability on June 6, 1959, equipped with 50 Sabres. The symbolism was unmistakable. Germany's most famous fighter squadron, named for the Red Baron, commanded by the greatest ace in history, flying American jets as part of NATO. The most controversial aircraft acquisition was yet to come. Beginning in 1960, West Germany acquired 916 Lockheed F-1004 starfighters, which became known as the Witwenmacher, the Widowmaker, and the Fliegender Sarg, the Flying Coffin. 292 of those 916 aircraft crashed, a 30% loss rate that killed 116 pilots. The year 1966 alone saw 27 crashes with 17 deaths, and the crisis led to the firing of Inspector Werner Panitsky on August 25, 1966, after he publicly criticized the procurement as a purely political decision rather than a sound military choice. The F-104 scandal damaged the Bundesluftwaffe's reputation and raised serious questions about the procurement process, though the force continued to grow and eventually became NATO's largest European air power. Meanwhile, 140 miles to the east, a very different German Air Force was taking shape. The German Democratic Republic's Air Force emerged from different roots and with radically different leadership than its Western counterpart. The Luftstreitkräfte der Nationalen Volksarmee, the LSK, or Air Forces of the National People's Army, was officially established on March 1, 1956, following the creation of the National People's Army itself on January 18, 1956. Origins traced back to 1950, when East Germany began maintaining pilot training through aero clubs to maintain civilian cover, a subterfuge that became necessary after the June 1953 uprising raised Soviet concerns about East German reliability. Heinz Kessler became Chief of Air Forces on September 1, 1956, holding the position until March 15, 1967, and his background stood in stark contrast to commanders like Kammhuber or Hartmann. Conscription brought Kessler into the Wehrmacht in 1940, but he deserted to the Red Army in 1941 because of his communist convictions. Nazi courts sentenced him to death in absentia for desertion, and he spent the rest of the war fighting against Germany. Soviet military academies trained him after the war, and he rose through the East German military hierarchy to eventually become defense minister from 1985 to 1989. German reunification brought consequences. Kessler was convicted for his role in deaths at the Berlin Wall and sentenced to 7.5 years in prison. He died in 2017 at age 97. The LSK operated under stricter Soviet control than any other Warsaw Pact Air Force, reflecting East Germany's critical frontline position facing NATO. Approximately 100 Soviet liaison officers were assigned to the Ministry of National Defense. Soviet advisors were present down to battalion level, and all officers were vetted by the Socialist Unity Party, the SED, East Germany's Communist Party. By the 1960s, nearly 95% of LSK officers were party members. Soviet or Czechoslovak sources provided all aircraft. The LSK received 101 MiG-15 BIS fighters and 26 MiG-15 UTI trainers beginning in 1956, followed by 288 MiG-17 variants from 1957 to 58, the largest single fighter type operated by the force. 24 MiG-19 farmers arrived in 1959, and for bomber capability they operated 12 to 15 Ilyushin Il-28 bombers from 1954. Ex-Luftwaffe personnel received sharply different treatment in the East compared to the West. About 27% of NVA officers were ex-Wehrmacht initially, similar to West Germany, and these veterans held 61 of the 82 highest command positions. The communist regime viewed them with suspicion, though. They represented the old military traditions, the officer class, the Wehrmacht heritage. The 1960s saw these veterans systematically phased out and replaced by officers with working-class backgrounds who were loyal to the SED. The LSK deliberately chose its name to invoke the pre-Nazi Imperial German Air Service, the Luftstreitkräfte, rather than embrace the Luftwaffe heritage that the West German Air Force had adopted. By the time the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, the LSK had become one of the most politically reliable forces in the Warsaw Pact, but also one of the most isolated from its own military heritage. Conclusion: 2 air forces, 2 Germanys, 1 legacy. 3 stories in one really make up the story of the Luftwaffe after World War II. The first story is the most comprehensive military dismantlement in history. The Allies scrapped 1,077,000 tons of equipment, destroyed all infrastructure, and banned aviation activity for nearly a decade while prosecuting war crimes, imprisoning personnel, and seizing every piece of technology they could find. The Luftwaffe that had conquered Poland in weeks and brought Britain to the edge of defeat was systematically erased. The second story involves the greatest technology transfer in aviation history. Operation Lusty captured 16,180 items of German aviation technology. German jet engines powered the first generation of American and Soviet fighters. German swept-wing research enabled the F-86 Sabre and influenced the MiG-15, and German scientists built the Saturn V rocket and the Soviet space program. The aircraft developed in the final years of the war became the foundation of the jet age. The third story is one of resurrection and irony. Within 11 years of its complete dissolution, 2 German air forces emerged, one serving NATO, the other serving the Warsaw Pact, each staffed by Germans but controlled by the superpowers that had defeated them. The contrasts could hardly be starker. West Germany embraced its Luftwaffe heritage and placed history's top aces in command positions, with Johannes Steinhoff, who had flown fighters against the Western Allies, eventually commanding NATO's entire military structure. East Germany rejected that heritage entirely and was led instead by a man who had deserted the Wehrmacht to fight for the Soviet Union. West Germany acquired American aircraft and became NATO's largest European air power, though it lost nearly a third of its starfighters to crashes. East Germany received Soviet jets under strict Moscow control, and its interceptors served as forward extensions of Soviet air defense. The men who had fought for the Luftwaffe ended up on opposite sides of the Iron Curtain. Erich Hartmann, after 10 years in Soviet prison camps, commanded a NATO fighter squadron, while other former Luftwaffe pilots served the East German Air Force. Some, like Hans-Ulrich Rudel, fled to South America and remained unrepentant Nazis. The technology had been seized, the organization had been destroyed, but within a decade, German pilots were flying jets again, some with American-designed swept wings, influenced by captured German research, others with Soviet engines based on captured German designs. The Luftwaffe died twice, once in the rubble of Berlin in May 1945, and again by Allied decree in August 1946. Military aviation in Germany proved impossible to suppress forever, though as the Cold War's demands for military power on the front lines of Europe made German rearmament inevitable. What emerged wasn't the Luftwaffe, despite the shared heritage and personnel. It was 2 new air forces serving different masters and representing 2 competing visions of Germany's future. The Bundesluftwaffe integrated into NATO's collective defense, while the Luftstreitkräfte served as an extension of Soviet power. Both forces have now passed into history. The LSK dissolved with German reunification in 1990, and the Bundesluftwaffe continues today, though much reduced from its Cold War strength, still flying as part of NATO. The legacy of the original Luftwaffe remains visible in museums around the world, where surviving Me-262s, Arado 234s, and Horten flying wings remind visitors of the revolutionary technology developed by German engineers. It remains visible in the swept wings of modern fighters, the axial flow compressors of jet engines, and the rocket technology that took humanity to space. The Luftwaffe was destroyed, but its innovations survived. Its personnel scattered, but many returned to service. Its organization was dismantled, but it was reborn twice on opposite sides of the Cold War. From total annihilation to resurrection as enemies. That's what happened to the Luftwaffe after World War II. If you found this video informative, please hit that like button and subscribe for more documentaries on World War II history. Leave a comment below if there are other aspects of post-war Germany or military history you'd like us to cover, and thanks for watching.